Welcome, everyone, to this week's session of the Science Circle Scientific Talks. My name is Stephen Gasior. I'm a molecular biologist in real life and here as Stephen Zootfly presenting in World. Today's talk is called Swimming with the Peptides, which is a storyline that I've known about for a very long time. Because there's, I think, some interesting anecdotal science to talk about here, that type of interesting process of discovery. But also, this is something that, in many ways, now is an even better time to talk about it because of the explosive amount of information and explosive amount of news about some recent drug classes that are basically making some people very rich and many people, I think, healthier overall. So to dive into the structure of the talk, what I'm going to talk about first is thinking about peptides in energy homeostasis. And so I think in many ways, this background will be something that is somewhat familiar. It's one of these very popular basic biology topics to talk about. And again, another one of the oldest drug classes that we've had on the market for a very long time, talking about insulin. Then we'll talk about the regulation of tanning and melanocytes and how peptides have become related to that. And then we'll talk about what is some of the interesting stuff that came out of that research. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the market and I think some of the perspective and interest going on with peptides. So let's begin. First off, when you eat food, everybody here, I'm sure, is aware and acknowledges the types of things that happen in your body. One, first of all, even before you eat, right, your body has developed this desire to eat, this hunger or an appetite. And then once you start eating, what typically happens is that hunger goes away, your body starts feeling full. In some cases, you actually start feeling tired. And what's really critically important here in all this is that your body is recognizing that it needs food and then how to process and take it in. And one of the key things in this is understanding sugar metabolism. So we kind of reduce it down to just talk about that. And so starting with this flow chart, the little number 1 on the top left there where it says the stimulus is that your body is taking in food, your stomach is digesting it, it's starting to eke into your small intestine and it starts getting absorbed into your bloodstream. And that's when your blood glucose levels start to rise. Now, again, lots of things are going into your bloodstream, but blood glucose is one of these things that is very specifically recognized because it is one of these key molecules in terms of energy metabolism. And the pancreas is stimulated to release insulin. And then insulin is this hormone. Again, it is also made of peptides, but we don't, from a pharmacological point of view, we don't call it a peptide. But that insulin goes throughout the blood, and some key targets is it tells many cells in the body, like your muscle cells, your brain cells, to absorb that from the blood and take it inside, to actively increase the amount of intake you have of that glucose. The other effect that happens is that the liver will take up that and start to store it as glycogen and then have that as energy storage for later. And if you start having an excess of that, then there are all these signals in the body to, as the blood glucose is rising, to turn that into other types of storage molecules like glycogen in the liver or into adipose tissue, in other words, triglycerides and fat. And the effect of this is that blood glucose should decline. And as the blood glucose begins to decline, we then go back to the left-hand side of the slide and think about now your stimulus is that blood glucose levels are starting to fall. And so in this case, the pancreas has different cells that are stimulated to release something called glucagon, which, again, glucose-related the, uh, regulating its metabolism in an opposite or antagonistic way to what insulin does. But glucagon then tells the liver, hey, all that extra glucose you were storing, start breaking that down and put that into the bloodstream. So that'll help the blood glucose start to rise. And then, among other signals that occur in the body, would of course eventually be things like increase your appetite, as well as even releasing energy from the more long term storage like adipose tissue. So people are familiar with this, and people are familiar with when this goes wrong. And I'm not going to talk about diabetes per se in this talk, but diabetes has these situations and effects where if you have a consistently high level of blood glucose, then your body starts converting it inappropriately. Your body starts developing an inability to regulate. It starts actually having effects on things like your brain as well as on your bloodstream and your cardiovascular system. So these are all things where I think, again, usually number one or number two, but in terms of preventable deaths within the United States, we typically consider diabetes to be number one or two because of all the health effects that too much glucose has on the body. So, but today's talk is getting into this idea of what peptides do. And the specific idea of peptides in terms of telling insulin or the liver or the pancreas what to do was actually been known for over 100 years. And so this began with something called the incretin hypothesis, where it was advanced that there's something from the gut that's telling insulin to then increase in the bloodstream in response to um, food coming in. And the kind of the early demonstration of that is if you take extracts from individual guts, you can actually reduce the urinary glucose excretion in individuals that have diabetes. So again, kind of an interesting way of thinking about this experiment of if you have an excess amount of glucose, which then gets excreted in the urine, and when somebody's diabetic, again, unable to modulate and lower their levels of glucose appropriately, then these little uh, factors seem to have this ability to do some hormonal type action. And these were known as GIP and GLP peptides. They were given those names early on for glucagon like peptide, and GIP, which we'll get into more later. And now, what I have boxed here in the what's glucose dependent insulin tropic peptide is what it's actually known as. And so now, what was known about the body, what was hypothesized, is that there would have to be receptors that are specific to those. So one thing I'll be referring to throughout the talk is the GIP receptor and the GLP-1 receptor, which are both this basic concept within biology that you have a ligand like GIP or GLP-1 that is going throughout the body and then acts on specific cells because those specific cells have receptors that bind to the ligand and then affect an action within the cell. And here's a demonstration from a more recent paper, but just showing that if you dose mice with an intravenous injection of these purified peptides, again, these are unmodified, regular mouse peptides, nothing modified about them, then as you dose them with an injection, then you can actually look at on what's shown on the y-axis is the amount of insulin that's being produced in the bloodstream. And so it's dose dependent, and that's actually relevant to usually how the body responds to actions is trying to have a dose dependent response. Again, the more food you eat, the more insulin you might need to make. So this is basic idea of how these things work. Now, what was the basic structure of these peptides were figured out back in the 1950s, actually. But glucagon-like protein, as well as the glucagon-like protein receptor, have both been crystallized and their very specific structure determined. And so here's a paper from 2010, where what you see in this kind of hazy white cloud is it's called like an electron filling model of what the receptor looks like, at least on the outside part of the cell. And within that, you see a black ribbon and some red arrows, and these are representing basically some internal structure of that protein. So again, what crystallography does is it attempts to understand on a per atom within each molecule basis exactly where they interact and what shape they take. And so the blue little ribbon, and that's again specifically an alpha helix. It's small. It's just a stretch of short peptides. It's a short stretch of peptides that is docking with the receptor, and it's showing that we do know at a very specific molecular basis what this interaction looks like and how it affects uh, the signaling pathway that happens. Now, an interesting story. So, as I've kind of indicated, we've known for over 100 years some of the basics of how all this works and understanding things at a molecular level. What was also interesting from a physiology level is that when you start thinking about regulating insulin and regulating how glucoses and potentially appetites are regulated within the body, then you start taking physiological approaches to understanding it. And this was, again, unfortunately, I don't have access to the paper, but I want to make sure I pointed out that, as many reviews did, that if you take a massive cancer, which is derived from glucagon producing cells, so those are called glucagonomas, that um, you can transplant that into a recipient rat and look at the effects. And what they showed, and this is just coming from the title, that if you transplant those onto rats, they then eventually start to suffer from severe anorexia and adipsia. So again, a lack of fat tissue. And this is an interesting way of recognizing that when you have some outside effect or pressure that is changing your hormone levels, then it actually ultimately, in this case, caused the rats to just not even be interested in eating. They could not eat enough to sustain their basal metabolic activities, and they just withered away into starvation. But what's bad for the rats, you can think, hey, that might be good for me as a Hollywood celebrity. And so, or as a therapy that helps people who have pathologies or other issues where that could be treated by, again, reducing appetite, reducing and having better glucose absorption into the body parts. So, but why weren't these peptides something that were used before, right? So we've shown, and scientists have known for a long time, that if you dose something with high amounts of these peptides, you can have physiological effects. And so the key thing here is that that small little blue ribbon I showed in the previous picture, it's small, but it also has a very short half-life. And so only about a minute and a half via an intravenous injection. You can sometimes get a longer half-life. You typically get a longer half-life if you do it as a subcutaneous or under the skin needle injection, like onto your stomach. And so the search was on, of course, for trying to find ways to have that be longer lasting and more available as a drug, as a pill, for example, as compared to an injection. Again, I don't know the story behind all this one, but the original one that people looked at was something called Exendin 4, which is a naturally occurring peptide from lizard venom, and that was shown to have a 30-minute half-life. Now, again, the problem with that is that because that peptide is different enough, then a very high likelihood within mammals or humans, you would develop an immune response to it. So you can't just take any drug that looks similar and hope that it works. But this was an opportunity for pharmacologists and chemists to think about ways to rationally modify it in a way to become more stable within the body. And so this first version of this is something called liraglutide, at least in terms of something that became uh, promoted as a drug. If you actually look at the papers, what they really do is they rationally come up with some ideas and try as many combinations as they can. So the basic table list of this was something like 30 different variations and compounds, and then iterating on top of that. And so what I'm showing here, a little bit from the structure, again, peptides, uh, one way that scientists talk about them is they give them a single letter code. So that A you see there, that represents the amino acid alanine. Uh, and other letters can represent leucine or glutamine or glutamate, all these different amino acids. They're very simple building block structures. And so you see here from this one, there are a couple modifications. But one of the key ones, if you see that blue K that's in the middle, they're adding in a glutamine type chemistry that you also see has a little tail going off to the left. And that tail going off to the and that tail going off to the left represents a fatty acid. You guys are familiar with fatty acids. These are the types of things when you think about oleic oils, palmitoyl acid, palm oil, olive oil. These are things that are a very common chemistry within organic organisms. They're just small fatty tails. And so the effect of this was actually to stabilize this version of the peptide for a half-life of about 13 hours, which is obviously a huge and dramatic improvement over a minute and a half. Now, this doesn't help overcome the fact that it still needs to be injected, but it does suddenly turn it into a drug category that then becomes potentially very useful. And this was something that was released on the market. And so it was approved by the FDA in 2014, as well as the European Medicines Agency in 2015. And again, it was very specifically prescribed for adults with a health concern, a body mass index of 30 or greater, and or a BMI of 27 or greater that also have some sort of weight related condition. And these were sold under the brand names Victoza as well as Saxenda. Has anybody heard of these? Is anybody familiar or have any experience with them? Because these are things that flew under my radar, I will have to say. Well, they similar, yes, they've been talked about a little bit more lately. And what's interesting, so clearly they're targeted for situations where obesity is becoming a medical problem for an individual. Now, I want to remind you that these were a daily injection, that you were also typically suggested the best practice was to take it before a meal. And oh, is this one Oprah talked about? All right, thanks, Thunder. That I remember her having this that being a conversation, but I did not remember exactly which one it was. No, again, there are some side effects. So, as you might imagine, if you're suddenly increasing a common signaling molecule that is playing an important part in the overall regulation of your body, then especially with multiple organ targets as well as energy metabolism, you can end up actually suffering from low blood sugar or nausea, uh, dizziness, abdominal pain, as well as the injection is uncomfortable. And over a long period of time, you can experience more severe symptoms like angioedema, pancreatitis, gallbladder issues, and kidney problems. So again, this was never a drug that really took off at a high level because of the dosing regimen as well as the side effects. But it was proof of concept that this peptide class of molecules can become a very powerful and useful pharmacological intervention. So now we're going to accelerate up to semaglutide, which was uh, taking the lessons learned from liraglutide and applying all these different variations of chemistry that you would hope would actually stabilize the molecule while still having it work and interact with the receptor very effectively. And so that's where semaglutide, where again, I'm showing the structure here. You can see it's very similar to liraglutide. If you look on the left part of the molecule, you'll see that there's an X in there, and that X represents an unnatural amino acid, so something that is not typically produced by the body, but is actually kind of similar to a natural amino acid. And then there's a little bit of differences with the linkage as well as the fatty acid that's coming off as well. So that way, its interaction and whatever stabilizes it within the body seems to be more efficient. Yes, there are many unnatural amino acids. Um, yeah, and so Protlinka, actually, I want to point out something Protlinka is actually mentioned here in the text. She said, back in the day, I worked at Dunkin' Donuts, and oddly, very few customers were overweight. And that was, again, a long time ago. And I think I actually watched a random YouTube video where they were comparing what people looked like as adults in the 70s as compared to what people who, are adult age in the 2010s look like. Just, looking at media, home movies, that type of thing. And there's a big difference in terms of the past 50 years. I don't want to get into it. This is not a conversation about all that, but I it's I think important to recognize that the problem of obesity, the problem of type 2 diabetes, and all of the associated medical effects is a growing problem over this time. And understanding all of the causes and things that relate to it is actually very complicated. Because otherwise, we think it might have been easy to fix. So, but getting back to semaglutide. So, these chemical modifications were shown to basically increase the half life to 55 hours. And so, again, and that's typical from an IV, how you study this in the lab. But when it comes time to um, your typical subcutaneous injection, that's actually even a bit of a longer half life. And so the dosing regimen for this is also a little bit is also relatively lower. You only need a quarter of a milligram once weekly dose. That's recommended for type 2 diabetes. And then again, and that was the original medical indication for this was just for type 2 diabetes. But as people discovered, as they did the clinical trials, they discovered an amazing effect on weight loss that was better than anything other than bariatric surgery. And so they put in applications for this drug to officially be something you could prescribe to treat obesity. And you start out at the same basic dose, but you're allowed to go to a higher dose because again, you need somewhat these higher doses to maintain that effect on weight loss. So Ozempic is the dosing regimen. It's that was originally put out, and you've probably heard the ads for that, and unfortunately, sometimes sing it to yourself. The Wegovy, it's actually the exact same drug. It's just recommended and again marketed and advertised within a different dosing regimen, so they have a new name for it. And there's also Rybelsus or Rybelsus, which is a daily oral tablet. So again, one thing you'll notice from this is that the dosing is, you know, um, about 40 times the dosing you would have for the injection. And that's because getting enough of that into the bloodstream and getting it through digestion that you have, denaturation you have in the stomach, and also its rate of absorption within the intestines uh, is not very effective. And so you have to give people a much higher dose for that to work. And that's one reason why, um, but an oral dose is obviously uh, lot easier to convince people to take and to maintain the dosing regimen. So now again, I have listed here, and this is kind of like a lot of commercials you might see on the TV, where it's just suddenly they list all these different side effects you can possibly have, and sometimes increase the rate of talking. But like I mentioned before, things that relate to nausea, other gastric functions, abdominal pain, fatigue, um, low blood sugar are what you can also find from these. And what's again something that's a little bit controversial, but I don't want to get into it too much. Is what are these effects on pancreatitis? You can also have this concept known as gastroparesis, which is a paralysis of the stomach, even absent a drug, and that can have some extremely severe consequences for health on its own. And again, that's sometimes just this very slowing down of the digestive process can lead to bowel obstructions, which are also again serious medical conditions. But the big thing is that this has been shown to be highly effective for this type of pathology in terms of both type 2 diabetes as well as obesity. And in general, these side effects tend to be manageable and relatively minimal. Now, I do want to come back to glucose dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, or GIP, that while GLP was the one that I think got the most intense and early successes in terms of stabilization and as a drug treatment, this was also being worked on independently. I think it's Pfizer is the one pushing it. That they did some of these again very similar chemical modifications. That if you have this peptide that is 39 subunits long, you find a good spot to link up some sort of fatty acid. And if you find that right combination of linkage at the right place, the right fatty acid, you can get this stabilization. And so you might have heard the name Monjaro. Same thing. It's stable enough to be used as a once weekly subcutaneous injection, similar side effects. And its approval, again, lagged behind Ozempic, but has been approved since 2022 in various countries worldwide. Again, similar to mechanism of action, they separately said, hey, what sort of dosing, what sort of opportunities do we have for this to be prescribed for weight loss? And so you might have heard just very recently something called Zepbound, and that's the marketing brand name for that. Um, so yeah, Phil was mentioning something about this being uh, without a doctor's okay. Again, I totally agree that in terms of understanding the dosing, understanding the reaction to this is something that really only makes sense within a medical supervision regimen. And then also, again, it's only available as a prescription at this point. So if you can even get it. So kind of any questions about that? I just want to give an example that, the reason why these are so um, popular right now is that they're a very effective way to deal with a common medical situation, and they're taking advantage of what the body is normally trying to do in terms of signaling what's going on within energy metabolism. And uh, also, for the purposes of this talk, I didn't want to get into it, but how these things actually work is much more complicated than just simple glucagon insulin balance. Because I think one thing, if you talk to people, and as I've read through the literature, people say they just feel less hungry. Some of this quiets the food noise. And these are effects that are more of a neurological uh, uh, place than necessarily just absorption of chemicals within the body. And so I think we're still working out all the details about how these actually work to help accomplish weight loss as well as alleviating type 2 diabetes. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit into another category of these peptides and thinking about how the body responds to light. So one of the common things everyone's familiar with is that you get enough light and you get both, you might get a sunburn. If you do a little more carefully, put on some sunscreen, you'll get a tan. And how this is being affected within the body is that your melanocytes produce something known as melanin, which is a very darkly pigmented compound. Again, some people from their inherited genetics naturally produce a lot more than others. And again, you can go back to the archives of my talk. I've talked about skin coloration and vitamin D in the past as well. What's important and relevant for this talk is that um, there are several hormones that are peptides that are known as melanocyte stimulating hormones. So MSHs, and there's alpha, beta, and gamma. And then, and I'm showing to structure this, you see it's even smaller than the peptides we talked about earlier, but again, a nice string of about 12, 14 amino acids with a very specific structure that is then at the ligand, and interacts with melanocortin receptors, and there's melanocortin 1, 2, 3, and 4 receptors within the body, although they also interact with other receptors. And what's shown in the diagram to the right, say, for example, in a melanocyte, that with this ligand to receptor binding, that it activates pathways and genes and all sorts of things going on in the body, where within the boxes you can see the ultimate effect is to help increase the body's response to ultraviolet radiation. There are anti-inflammatory responses, and then, at least in the case of melanocytes, melanin synthesis. And so again, this is how the body recognizes environmental signals, has a reaction, starts signaling what to do and how to respond. And within this response to light, again, chemists were thinking, how can we help create better tanning products? And so one of these is known as melanotan 1. It was a very early analog of uh, melanocyte stimulating hormone alpha. That now again, understandably, this is not it was ended up not being very specific to the receptor 1, like I just showed. But it was a promising drug within trials. And again, within the green bubbles, you see some slight chemical modifications. Again, not as dramatic as what we saw with GLP. And what had been shown and what has been shown in the scientific literature is that these peptides are able to activate transcription factors to help produce eumelanin, and then also activates other enzymes that are also there for producing more eumelanin as well. And so the value of this is that um, it was shown to be effective at helping produce melanin in patients. That um, it's it's oddly enough, again, I don't know anything about pharmacology and trademarks, but it has a non-proprietary name of melanotan or of afamelanotide. And so again, there's not any one company that is given it this drug compound name. Now it does have a brand name of Sanisi, which has been approved to treat erythropoietic protoporphyria since 2019. And that is a disease where you have an abnormal hemoglobin production, which is due to some genetic defects in the iron metabolism and heme production. And so when you have this, you can get this accumulation of another compound known as protoporphyrin 9. And when the light interacts with that compound, it can actually cause intense skin pain as well as redness and thickening. And so this is again, it's an orphan disease. There are not a lot of examples of people with this. This is not a um, high volume, high return on investment type of drug, but it does have this very targeted effect that if you can help people produce more melanin, then you can actually get alleviation. That's what was shown in clinical trials. Um, and so this drug is out there for pain, for helping people with this condition. So again, a very nice success story. Ultimately, it's never been produced specifically as a tanning solution. But within that drug development time, again, people are trying to find ways to either make it more specific for melanocytes and that recognition pathway, uh, and testing it. And so one of the modifications they've made is actually kind of cyclicize the compound. So you notice if you look at the melanotan 2, as well as the bremelanotide that's on the right, you'll notice that instead of just being one long linear molecule from one end to the other, there are actually two pathways to get through that. And that's because there's this beta lactam ring, or sorry, a lactam ring that ends up being the modification that helps make it more stable. And so this is an interesting story that as they were testing this to see if they could make a better tanning agent, uh, within the experiments that were performed, there were lots of anecdotal reports of the patients who are going through these trials of feelings of arousal. And so again, I took a picture from a tanning agency of a woman kind of giving that look, I think, of, hey, I'm tanning. I may not be getting a tan, but something's going on. And then concurrent with this, what actually they showed in and you can find a lot of scientific literature about this, is that they saw many indications of arousal in rats and mice. And so uh, right now, I have probably a very strange Google search history that I may hopefully don't end up regretting. But um, what was very clear is that there were effects of these modified peptides that were happening physiologically to the people who were taking them. And then again, this is one of these things like the little bit like the LSD story of um, of an individual within the testing scientific body who said it says inadvertently self administered a dose twice the expected concentration, and then he personally experienced and documented an 8 hour long erection, along with some nausea and vomiting and some gastrointestinal effects. So again, one of these, I think we call them happy accidents, but it was consistent with what they've been seeing in the rat physiology. And then again, as it says here, this could end up being very powerful as an agent for erectile dysfunction. And of course, that led to more clinical trials. And so, without going through all the details of the clinical trials, there's a lot of funding that went into this. There's actually a little bit of drama in terms of the intellectual property and what happened with the companies. So, melanotan 2 never made it as a drug, and that's because its overall effectiveness was not high enough, and the adverse effects were a bit too much. Again, remember, this is something that's another compound, it's a peptide, where its main delivery route is via injection. Um, However, what has gained traction within the clinical trials and within thinking about it as a drug class is that the FDA has approved bremelanotide. Again, this is marketed under the brand name Belisi. Again, if you look through literature, its testing brand name was known as peptide 141 or PT 141. That it has been approved for hypoactive, again, diagnosed hypoactive sexual desire disorder in premenopausal women. So that was approved in 2019. Now, again, this is oh, interestingly, it's gender specific, right? The FDA has not approved this for hypoactive sexual desire in men. It's also not approved for women that are postmenopausal. And I think and I don't know offhand, but it's again not specifically prescribed for even younger women. It's like this very restricted age and life stage range that and it's not due to other things that you could diagnose, so psychological, medical, or other relationship problems. Uh, Again, it's an injection, can lead to side effects related to injection. Common side effects include nausea as well as headache. And there can be cases of temporary decreases in blood pressure, heart rate, um, and again, kind of maybe consistent with what's going on with what we know about the drug development. Sometimes people see darkening of the gums, face, and breast. Um, there was developed and tested a nasal inhaler version that under phase 2 clinical trials showed adverse events, but I haven't wasn't able to track it down specifically, but I do believe that it has also been FDA approved, but you just don't see it um, as well advertised as the injection version. So now, what's really interesting to point out here is that even though the physiology that we talked about for men of having like an 8 hour erection, this is not the same as like Cialis or um, Viagra. This is not something that is acting at directly as an inhibitor of the nitric oxide signaling mechanism or the reuptake and degradation of nitric oxide. And so what's very important to recognize is that these seem to be an indirect effect on uh, those tissues through a signaling hormone through the brain, as well as other, hormone levels in the body. And so that's what I want to talk about is that what people have discovered with this category of drugs is that this seems to act most specifically on the melanin uh, receptor 4. And that, as I mentioned earlier on, there are four melanocortin cortisol corticoid receptors in the body that have very different tissue distributions as well as effects on the body. Um, oh, I should say, actually, Orange Planner mentioned something I forgot to mention, which is um, yes, if you have an erection that lasts longer than 4 hours, you are supposed to seek medical attention. And this is what you always see in Viagra or Cialis commercials. And that's because if you have this restricted blood flow in the body, in that particular part of the body, you're not getting enough oxygen exchange. You can get a buildup of carbon dioxide in those tissues and actually cause permanent damage. What's actually been noted about uh, bremelanotide and uh, melanotan 2 is that those issues don't seem to occur either in mice or rats or in humans. So there seems to be something different about the mechanism of the erection, such that you're not. It's not the same thing as the way it works with Cialis. Sorry, with Viagra. Um, so Wisdom Seeker mentioned something about the idea that Viagra reduces likelihood of dementia in men, and I think that is an important part and facet of understanding that drug class. the The thought behind it is that these PGE inhibitors that are helping with cardiovascular dilation um, in the penis actually have some slight side effects. So you're just getting better circulation throughout the body, including the brain. And one thing we know about dementia is that if you have things that limit blood flow in the brain, that can lead to dementia. So it might be helping inhibit that. And so that's, I think, the interesting thing here that Phil's mentioning is that this class of drugs seems to have a direct effect on libido. And that's what I'm coming back to around here, that in this diagram, when we think about how these ligands interact with the body and look to um, drive some sort of physiological response, that depending on where they act and what they normally do can have different effects on the body. And so one thing that's interesting about these receptors is that this interaction where MCR4 is reactive to bremelanotide that leads seems specifically to be a arousal sexual drive response, but MCR4 in response to other compounds actually is a part of the energy metabolism. And so MCR4 is the most common monogenic form of obesity. And they've shown that in mice, when you knock that out, you actually see issues with severe obesity. And that's something I'm going to mention here is that when you look at the receptor, um, common form of monogenic obesity. And that's because what's happening within the diagram that I meant to talk about more here is that when you have signals from the body, what those are actually doing are telling you to decrease your appetite at some level as you're getting body insulin turned on, as you're increasing the expression of GLP and GIP. This is telling the body that glucose levels are high. It comes back around and says, don't eat more food and decreased appetite. And that's a part of the MCR, MC4R response in the hypothalamus. Okay. Um, and there's been a good amount of work with mice showing this as well. So this is where I want to come back to, I think, integrating both the first and second part of the talk is that the body has very fine-tuned as well as multifaceted ways to react to the environment. And again, this specific example, talking about energy metabolism, is that the hypothalamus, which again has comprised of two parts, the ARC and the PVN, that this is actually putting out hormones to tell the body what to do. But at the same time, the hormones that are in the body are then going back to the hypothalamus in terms of this energy signal, the input from insulin and leptin, telling it how to then maintain this homeostatic balance. And so the specifics of this are important for understanding human physiology, but then the value, as we see from these peptides as pharmacological agents, is that this is places where we can have a very specific and effective way to intervene in these axes to help maintain or to work as a medical intervention. And so I just want to kind of touch on the idea of what the peptides market is. So this is some market analysis from Global Market Insights that came out last year, where the worldwide market for peptides is almost $40 billion, but they're expecting a year-over-year growth of anywhere between 7 to 20%. And so this is an area, and Dolly mentioned, seems to be a pretty linear increase in terms of the market size. Now, I think they might have been, at the time they were writing the report, they might have been underestimating the demand and the popularity that's taken off with Ozempic and with Govi and Zepbound. And so I do wonder if this will end up being revised in the near future. But in terms of the drug class, and this, so again, this largely represents really just only a couple areas of intervention because the number of peptides that have been approved is, as I mentioned, relatively small for the number of treatments that are available or the conditions. And so, but I do want to end this note, again, from a scientist who's looked at and kind of followed this storyline for a while, is that, peptides, which are a, a natural category of messenger within the body that act in very specific ways, but then also have multiple effects in the body, uh, can be both flexible, specific, and very robust. And so these analogs can play that role as well, as long as you can find a way to make sure that they're stable and that their delivery, works out pretty well. And then that you're managing whatever sort of side effects you have. And so, but the interesting thing right now in molecular biology and chemistry and pharmacology is that these factors we have and the toolkits we have to enhance stability, as well as thinking about delivery into the body, either via injection or oral route, these are becoming better and better understood and better applied. And so I think that uh, as a category of drug class and category of things that this can treat, this will actually be a pretty fascinating space to watch that has a lot of promise to it. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I hope you learned something. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to stick around and we're just talk about these peptides in the market. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, actually, I need to grab a quick sip of fluid myself. Yeah, I would say, let me follow up with one just thing real quickly, which is, anecdotally, there are lots of cases of people who, if you look at YouTube, you can find a lot of videos of people talking about taking PT 141, both men and women. And so, a reminder that, just because a drug category can't be prescribed for something specifically, um, it doesn't mean it doesn't have that effect. And so it's a matter of getting a drug to market on a prescription basis includes both, a medical need as well as the clinical trials to support the fact that it doesn't have side effects for every category of patient you might have. One thing that's very interesting about the GLP and GIP analogs is, you have to go through separate trials, but you can now prescribe them for uh, people down to the age of 12. And there might even be some prescriptions of people looking at it at younger ages to try and intervene in early childhood obesity. Okay, I'll have to check out this princess video. I'm not going to do it right now. So, any questions? Any curiosities? Anybody who wants to talk about their experience with any of these drug categories, if you're willing to share that information, that'd be great. Because I think one of the underlying stories that's valuable to think about is that some of the way these are acting, especially in the anti-obesity space, has as much to do with neurological effects as just as what they were predicting and thinking was going to happen as something that helps increase the expression of insulin. Well, I mean, so yeah, so wisdom says unexpected consequences in a good way, and I mean, I would say in that case, kind of yes. That what actually would be interesting. I think this is something to think about is side effects, right? And side effects compared to how you think your drug is going to work can be good and bad. And so this idea that people's neurology is quieting the quote unquote food noise and thus helping overcome some of the mental things that drives certain categories of obesity or diabetes, that's a valuable side effect. But of course, we were also dealing with, you know, parabiosis, right? Where suddenly people, their ability to have food is incredibly compromised, and they might even require surgical interventions to be able to move food through their body again. And so, what always I think is kind of interesting is that once a drug actually hits a larger market, and sometimes it's very hard to know these things until they actually are taken by tens of thousands of people filing, adverse effects reports to really understand this. And so, what would be and I think this is the promise of peptide type of therapies, is that we might be able to find a variation of a peptide that can actually just help directly quiet food noise, something that works within the neurological hypothalamus axis that is not also directly causing the slowdown in digestion in the stomach. There may be peptides or receptor actions that can separate those two functions within this homeostasis axis. And then that would actually be, you know, potentially a better intervention with less side effects for more people. Well, that's a good question. I think that it kind of comes down to, pharmacology and human physiology is hard and complicated. What has been nice is that the work in rats and mice have actually been very relevant and very applicable and enlightening in these cases. Yeah. So, Sam, you're reiterating a question or a point that Wisdom brought up earlier about Viagra being useful. That there seems to be some protective effect of more often daily Cialis, more so than occasional Viagra use for men in terms of protective against Alzheimer's or dementia. And the mechanism for that seems to be more through better blood flow. So even though they're called PGE inhibitors, they're things that um, inhibit the uptake of prostaglandins, and that seems to be more specific for the corpus cavernosum, the penile tissue, as compared to general uh, blood vessels throughout the body. But there's still a little bit of that side effect throughout the body. So when again when they talk really fast and describe all the side effects of Viagra usage, they'll describe things like your face getting flush, low blood pressure, potential fainting. These are all things that indicate that the effect is not entirely specific for the penis. And so if you're doing something that is helping with your cardiovascular blood flow, that can have protective effects, specifically in the cases of things like dementia and Alzheimer's, where people have shown the converse that, or I guess that would be the contrapositive, that if you have bad blood flow, that is a risk factor for Alzheimer's and dementia. Yeah, I was going to mention something about bariatric surgery. So bariatric surgery, there are a couple different variations of it. There's the reversible way of doing it, where you put a band around the stomach that just constricts the available space. You can also have a surgery in which they actually cut out a big part of the stomach or seal it off in a way that it only can take so much food. And so, yeah, okay, glad I answered your question, Sam. And so this has always been, I think, to me, one of the issues with bariatric surgery is that in some cases, again, bariatric surgery was something actually used to try and treat specifically obesity. But then when they rolled this out in large scale, they discovered it actually helped with people's type 2 diabetes, which was not something that people were necessarily expecting. And as they went through and examined this, they discovered that there were changes in the hormone axis where suddenly insulin receptors were becoming more responsive, or there were other changes in peptide levels, the signaling pathways, that type 2 diabetes actually started getting reversed. That was independent of just, appetite and food intake. But the problem with bariatric surgery, and the reason why people may or may not have been good candidates, is that if you still had this appetite drive, if there was something in your physiology where your obesity was driven by this food noise, this appetite, this hunger to eat food, and then not really feeling the effects of becoming full, well, bariatric surgery is the worst thing you could have because then you're going to keep eating food. And if your signals are not responsive in the correct way, then you're overstuffing this really small stomach space. And that could actually lead to even more dire complications. And so, I think, but even the bariatric surgery, it was always just very simply thought, oh, you make less space available for food, they eat less, they lose weight. And in fact, the story ended up becoming so much more complicated. One of the actually even follow up that even one of the things that they found for the stomach was that different hormones in different parts of the stomach express different things. And so, depending on exactly which part of the stomach and how any given person's work, stomach actually worked, you could actually have different effects for different people. Yeah, and I think that's one thing that um, um, I think is kind of important to recognize about Ozempic. When they did the clinical trials, they did track people after they were done taking the drug, and they've been, I think, highlighting the fact that a high percentage of people, once they go off the drug, do actually gain quite a bit of weight back. And so now, again, you're a drug company and you see an indication of data like this, you're going to say, oh, you should take my drug for the rest of your life and keep paying for it for the rest of your life. That's how they're going to think about it. But I do think that what would really be valuable to understand is that the peptide may be doing something very specific and that you can lose those effects, but it also could be an opportunity to do other things in terms of your relationship to food and calories at the time that you're taking the drug to actually help uh, make it a long-term solution and also less expensive. Yeah, and I think it's actually so Protlinka is reiterating that point that there are a lot of people online who keep reiterating that, and I think you have to be very careful because I think there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say that. And this is like, I don't think it's quite exactly the same story as Lipitor or other things like antidepressants or other, schizophrenia like drugs. in those cases, there's a very good physiological case to be made for why going off them, your body swings in some precarious ways. And Lipitor is something where, um, you go off it, it's just going to come back. There's nothing you can really necessarily do with that type of intervention if you had uh, high cholesterol in the first place, because that's probably genetic. Um, but I think there's an opportunity. There's always an opportunity to retrain your brain. And in some cases of obesity, there is going to be a part of the brain training that you can do. Like, let's face it, for a lot of people, dieting alone is a successful intervention, along with changing really what it is. It's changing your relationship to food and also changing your relationship on a daily basis, to your energy metabolism. And so I do wonder. I mean, I think it's an interesting argument that will have to be played out. Um, we'll see if there are people willing to fund clinical trials or other sort of well-studied scientific trials of people who go off the drug and keep having maybe coaching or other ways of thinking about restricting their energy intake versus people who don't, and then really compare what does or does not work. Linka is asking about graduated withdrawal to help prevent backlash weight gain. I don't know that anybody studied that. A lot of these big drug trials have just been done in the past 10 years. So you know, the emphasis there is looking at efficacy and safety of a simple drug regimen in the first place. But it's a very good question. I mean, I think this really um, that's one way of thinking about it to help people, and that's what I think you do see with psychoactive drug therapy regimens, is that you try and do a graduated withdrawal. Yeah. Okay. So we're thinking the same thing. It'll be interesting to see. I think it'll be really interesting, and that's one thing that it would not surprise me if there are intermediate doses, lower doses that maybe help a lot of people quiet the drug noise, like this idea of the food noise, um, that are much lower dose than all the effects it has on insulin axis. So it'll be interesting to see. I also think there'll just be new peptide classes. I mean, one thing that's you know there are huge. Once you have a drug class that's in the billions of dollars and treats something like either obesity, erections, cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, or things like um, skincare, you know, every 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 less creative pharmacological company in the world is going to say, "Can we do some variation of this that we can capture something that's unique, get into the market, and work on it?" So I think we'll see a lot of stuff happening in the space. Well, Phil, Phil brings up a point. He's not a fan of throw a drug at it substitute to treat the symptoms and not the root of the problem. And I mean, in general, I I agree and both disagree in the case of type 2 diabetes and obesity. And there are two counter arguments I would make. Is that one, I don't know that we fully understand the problem. And that if we don't really have a very good handle on what the causes of type 2 diabetes and obesity are in today's world and market. We do know some of it. I'm not saying we're completely ignorant, but I think there's a lot of complicated stuff that happens, and that you honestly, in some cases, because of a laissez-faire culture, we end up intervening late. And so there's that. The other thing too is I don't I don't know. Um, Peter Attia talks about this, and that um, I, it's easy to kind of think of this as being a lifestyle problem in the first place, that people are fully cognizant and understand that they're doing something that's not good for them and they just keep doing it. And I think the way we think about psychology and neurology these days is that that's just at its core not necessarily true. And so it's not as easy as intervening of I'm aware of I need to change the problem and then just having that happen. And so I think there's this in this particular case a very complicated conversation to have. Although, you know, I agree with you in general. I mean, if we really want to treat the root cause of any problem best we can, I'm just not sure that we have all the tools to do that these days. Yeah, this is diabetes in a sense. Yeah. Um, yeah, so and that let me tie this into Lincoln's comment that there are people who have eating disorders because of psychological trauma, right? And so just saying eat less, it's a good idea to count your calories. That's not an intervention that's useful. And so having a drug that directly acts upon something that is problematic within the physiology of the patient is where at least is definitely a good place to start. Although I also agree, I think it is, we don't want a world where everybody's dependent upon drug companies, you know, uh, all the time. That's not good either. So Sam mentions the idea of short walks, and I think there's a huge amount of evidence, and I'm also supportive of this idea that I think it's 3 days a week, 30-minute walks, not even vigorous walking, but just not slow walking, but regular walks have a huge impact compared to the baseline of not exercising at all. Now, again, the degree of impact and degree of effect there, when you're talking about your starting point being no exercise at all, is kind of faint praise. But it's very clear that the body is expecting and is at its best when you're getting in, regular walking level exercise. But those recommendations really are coming from the place of, hey, if you're not exercising at all, you should at least do this. What would really be best would be make sure that you have vigorous cardiovascular exercise. I think it's 3 or 4 times a week. Have a balance of, you know, um, impact or, where you're lifting weights in addition to cardiovascular is all kind of the best thing for long-term health. Yeah, one thing that's worth mentioning, when we think about these things are trying to intervene in terms of calorie restriction, and this is something that's also been in the news lately for uh, these diets where you like intermediate fasting, where you spend like 12 hours every day not eating, taking in any calories at all, or even do it for longer, like 24-hour ones. You actually start losing lean muscle mass. And so, and that's something that people are seeing a little bit as a side effect. And I didn't even mention it because I think there's not as much consistent science with it. That these Ozempic Wegovy interventions can lead to this loss of muscle, and that's also in the long term not necessarily a good intervention as well. Well, I mean, one thing that's very clear from dietary recommendations and just thinking about it is that refined sugar and simple carbohydrates are really pretty bad for the body. And that kind of comes down to this too. When I showed these diagrams for glucose metabolism, your body is very reactive to how quickly glucose itself is getting in the body. And so here's an example. Actually, here's a really interesting anecdotal story. One problem that diabetics have is they can get a lot of pain, sweating, um, and heat flashes when they're sleeping. And this is because they get so hypoglycemic that their body's starting to react to it. And if you're sleeping, I mean, you're obviously not taking in any calories during that time. And anecdotally, what's been shown is that if you drink a cornstarch fueled drink before you go to bed, because the cornstarch, the the bioavailability of glucose in cornstarch is very different than from table sugar. And so the time of delivery, the bioavailability of that glucose from cornstarch lasts for hours, especially while you're sleeping. And your digestion metabolism is slowed down too. That people can actually make it through the night much more easily if they're diabetic when they have complex carbohydrates as a part of their food. Lincoln's mentioning that people will eat simple sugars to self-medicate, and PTSD and ADHD situations, and then treating the side effect, the weight gain, is seen as preferable to treating the core for many people, and drug companies are happy to meet the demand. Um, yeah, again, I don't. Again, I know there's a whole dopamine serotonin cycle response that comes from eating sugar, and then related to those pathologies. Um, Again, I don't want to speak to what drug companies do or don't do. They certainly like having customers, um, but I think in many cases, drug companies are only treating one lane. They're either they have drugs for the PTSD or ADHD, and not the other companies have the ones for the weight gain. Yeah, I'm still not sure about the direct marketing of drugs to consumers. It's still, on the one hand, I think it has a lot of net positive effects of letting people know that they do potentially have options for treating things that they may not have thought about. But I think it also gets people and doctors annoyed with lots of kind of nonsensical situations and people thinking that they should get a drug when it's not in any way relevant.